And now I get to welcome Ben Sumpter, who's going to talk to us about Kassiteros, deciphering the oldest Greek and Roman sources of the tin trade. So this sounds like a really ancient industry. So welcome, Ben.
Oh,
Over to you.
thank you very much, Hilary. Good evening, everyone. What an absolute pleasure it is to have you all here. This is the first talk of the year, isn't it?
Yeah.
We started off on the new year. Fantastic, folks. It's an absolute pleasure to be presenting this presentation, this topic. I say it's about almost every topic I talk about, but truly, this is one of my favourite topics to talk about. It's a matter that has lit the flame that has never been extinguished ever since I've been studying this for the last maybe sort of 4 or 5 years, and I'm still just as passionate about it now as I was in the past. Now, the name of the talk is Kassiteros, and it's a bit of a difficult name to pronounce, but we're going to talk about what it means, why I've named my talk this, and so on and so forth, and also why I'm delivering this for you, the Mullion Old Cornwall Society. Mullion is not famous for its tin mines. In fact, there aren't any tin mines in Mullion, let's be honest. I gave a little bit of a talk on the mines of Mullion last year, I believe, and that was fascinating. It was about copper mining. But don't forget, Mullion is still part of the rest of Cornwall. And so perhaps you're here to learn about Cornwall's most famous export. It's tin, after, of course, pasties and Trelawney. Apart from that, folks, let's get into it, because this talk, although it's quite difficult to see, I wonder whether we lower the lighting on the front row. Is that possible? Just the front row?
No, the other side.
Other side?
Yeah.
Brilliant. This dramatic image just here that has hopefully greeted you whilst you arrive contains almost all the information that you need to know about this subject matter. But we need to decipher it. For example, what is this funny writing that we see over here? Who is this dapper-looking gentleman? And what is this strange name? A talk that you've managed to turn up for, but perhaps you don't even know what the word means. We're going to go and study that in great detail. But first, a little bit about me. Now, you know me already, but this is me doing my day job. I'm an underground guide. I'm a cave guide and underground explorer. And so I take people underground, and I love one of the few professionally qualified people to do this in the Southwest. And doing this, of course, as part of my cave guiding, I explore many, many mines and caves around Cornwall. It got me very interested in the history. And of course, you can study the history in manuscript form in places like Crescent-Kerno. This is how I did my research for the mines of Mullion. And of course, you find beautiful maps. There's a little bit of a problem with the slides here today, folks, but this should be quite a nice detailed mine plan. And these little spindly-looking things are the tunnels. This is actually underneath Carbis Bay. So we've got some fantastic detail from the middle of the Industrial Revolution. This mine actually goes underneath the seabed. Quite amazing. But we can go further back. In the 18th century, there's also these mine plans like this, slightly less detailed, but still very interesting. If you go back to the 16th century, so from almost 500 years ago, you can still find mine plans that mention little mines on them. How fantastic. One of them, down the west, is a little mine that I own and run for my business. Fantastic. And we can see evidence of this medieval mining in the landscape today. Great stuff. This is what mining looked like at that time period, but we can go back even further. For example, this here is the earliest representation of what miners looked like in Cornwall from about 700 years ago. And you can see these miners, it's actually quite primitive. They're not wearing your normal mining garbs, they're wearing tunics in the same way that the Romans might have worn. Simple hats, but look at the tools. They're using a spade and a mattock, but not pickaxes. And that's because mining at this time period was something that actually happened above ground. For example, on Dartmoor, like this picture shows, this is where they've excavated the surface away and they found these stones of tin that lie hidden underneath the ground in the remains of old stream beds in the same way that you might pan for gold. And this diagram shows it quite clearly. They'd store up water, discharge it, and then that would allow them to go and dig away at the weak soil which contained the tin. Necessarily, it was called tin streaming. But can research even earlier back in time if we go to the National Archives, because you find things like this. These are stannary court rolls. This is one here. It's for a curia, a court, tenta apud Elistobar. Where's Elistobar? Can you guess? That is a reference to Helston from 1364. And all of these are names of the miners that were present. The amount of detail is staggering, and there's nothing that compares to it for the time period. The fact that we have this mining history is really, really useful for our family history studies as well. But we can go even further back than the 14th century. We can actually go and look at these things. These are called pipe rolls because they look a little bit like a pipe. They are records of the medieval exchequer. Now, I don't really follow politics, but isn't it Angela Raymer who's the current Chancellor of the Exchequer? Is that correct? Rachel Reeves. I told you I didn't study politics. Rachel Reeves. This is the medieval equivalent of Rachel Reeves. Anyway, so when we look at this, we find some amazing detail. This is for Cornwall and Devonshire just here. So if we look at this section just here, this is the earliest record of mining in Cornwall in the medieval time period. Etidem vice comes debitum, and then it's £16, 13 shillings for ordinary de menaria stani. Menaria stani of tin mines. This is from 1156, and that is the earliest record that we have of mining. But that can't be right. How could it possibly be that we only go back that far? There must have been earlier mining. We all know how the story ends, but how did it begin? Well, that's what this talk is about. It's a talk about the earliest records of Cornish mining. And that's something that does affect Mullion, because without Cornish mining, you wouldn't have the mines of Mullion as well. Yes, it's a talk about tin mining, but it's very relevant for people such as yourselves who also bear a mining history. So, let's begin. Here is the first question for you. Have you heard of these guys before? Everyone has. I always do this, and I love hearing your responses. What did they do, just out of interest?
They were traders.
They were traders. They were traders. Who did they trade with?
Pretty well anybody.
Anybody. I'm fishing, folks. There's a widely held belief that the Phoenicians traded with Cornwall. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but let me add some context and meat to those bones. We do know that the Phoenicians visited Cornwall. That is true. We know that actually from two things, archaeology and from historical accounts. One historical account is a much later written source here of something called the Ora Maritima, or basically a poem about the sea. This is actually written in the 5th century by a Roman, not by a Phoenician. However, what it talks about is something that is broadly believed to be a genuine historical event from about 1,000 years earlier than it was written, from about 500 BC. And what happens is he describes in this poem how Himilco of Carthage here, Carthage is the Carthaginian, or so the Phoenicians were also known as the Punics or the Carthaginians as well. And one of their trading outputs was Guerra, or modern-day Cadiz in southern Spain. That was kind of like furthest Phoenician outpost. And it seems as though they travelled around the Iberian Peninsula, across the Bay of Biscay, and they may well have reached the British Isles. But they're not very flashing with how they describe it. They talk about how their ship got ensnared in seaweed and how the water was sluggish because there wasn't any wind. They weren't very happy about the prospect of trading with little old us. So, if we look at the archaeological dimension, we know that there are a few Phoenician finds. We find these Siculo-Punic coins, but there are not many of them, and they're all concentrated over here in East Anglia. Definitely not in the southwest. And this is really, really interesting. We actually know a lot about the Iron Age, the time period that Phoenicians were at their height. But we know that the Phoenicians were not a dominant trading partner of the British Isles at this time period. The Phoenician contact with Cornwall is a widely held myth. However, everything that you attribute to the Phoenicians is true of someone else. And that is these guys, the ancient Greeks. This is a Massilian, or a stater from Greek Marseille, from the 4th century BC. And look at these. They are everywhere. The Greek contact with the British Isles is everything that we attribute to the Phoenicians, but it's real. Replace Greeks with Phoenicians in your mind, and you are absolutely spot on. The Greeks were the earliest trading partners that we had, the earliest literate trading partners, long before the Romans were here. This is really interesting. But what are the Greeks doing in the Western Atlantic anyway? I thought Greece is miles away. If you want to go and get on a plane, it's not very close at all. Well, this map explains it. Because in two halves here, you have a northern half, which is kind of red, and a southern half, which is kind of purple. You have the Greek apoikia, or diaspora of colonies, and the southern half you have the Phoenicians. By the middle of the Iron Age, by the middle of the first millennium BC, the Phoenicians had conquered all of the southern Mediterranean, and the Greeks had conquered the north. How fascinating. They created a dichotomy. The reason we know this, by the way, is because these things have been written down, and they've been preserved by monks who would copy and copy from the original papyrus scrolls further on. And you find them in medieval libraries like this one at Hereford. If you ever get a chance to visit the Hereford Cathedral Library, the chain library, it is amazing. So, what I started doing was doing my own study in these medieval libraries. Now, many of the medieval libraries have been broken up, and they're now kept in proper modern archives. And there's a few of them around here. For example, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. You've got the Leiden University as well. And then the most important of all of them was this guy over here, the Vatican Secret Library. And when I found this out, my heart sank. I was thinking to myself, how on earth can I get into the Vatican Secret Library? Well, it turns out it's all online. Made my job a lot easier. So I went to the Vatican Library digitally. It's a blessing doing modern research, an absolutely wonderful thing. What I found was that there were 5 source texts that talked about ancient Greek tin trading with Cornwall. 1 would be amazing. 5 is incredible. I've studied all of them in great detail. I'm going to show you some of the more interesting aspects of this. And here they are, with their authors and their original manuscripts, or their oldest manuscripts. You have Herodotus, Polybius, Caesar, Diodorus, and Pliny. Some of these you might already know. Pliny, exactly. I like Pliny. Pliny's one of my favourite guys. And again, like I said, the reason these things have survived is the original authors wrote them on papyrus, just like this one. This is an original piece of papyrus. Papyrus almost never survives outside of Egypt. And so those papyri, well, they've been copied into parchment codices by medieval monks. They've been put into books like this fantastic Gospel of St. Cuthbert on Holy Island. That's Ezra and his study, a contemporary illustration from the 8th century AD of what that might look like. And then, of course, when the printing press comes along, they were printed, and that meant they would never be destroyed. So fantastic stuff. What we can do with these manuscripts, because they were copied and copied and copied, is we can analyse them in minute detail. When people copy things, they make mistakes, don't they? It's a standard thing. If you look at what mistakes have been copied from one manuscript to another, you know which manuscript gave onto the next manuscript. Does that make sense? It's a bit like a family tree of manuscripts. And that's what we construct as classicists and through a subject called textual criticism today. This is the stemma codicum, or the family tree of those manuscripts. And you can see all the manuscripts here of this author, Diodorus Siculus. It all originates in 4 prototype manuscripts that survive. We don't want to study these ones. We want to study the most original versions. And what I found in the Vatican Library were these 2 over here and this one over here. This is really exciting. That is the oldest manuscript that survives for Cornwall's earliest piece of history. So off I went to the National Library of Naples in Italy, of course. What a fantastic thing the internet is. And so what I found was this. This is Cornwall's earliest source text. If you are a historian who's interested in Cornwall, if you're a historian in general, this is where our history begins. This is our source text. It is our genesis of what we are as Cornish people in the literate word. If you want to go further back than this, you only have one tool at your disposal, and that's archaeology. This is the dawn of Cornish history. And I want to study it in detail. Who is this Diodorus guy? Well, he comes from Agurion in Sicily, modern-day Sicily, Siculus. And he lived in a world there underneath the Roman Empire. This is the 1st century BC, so he was a Roman citizen, but part of this Greek diaspora that had settled all across the Mediterranean. Fantastic. And of course, you can see it just here. The Greeks inhabit the north, the Phoenicians the south. By the time they fall to the Roman Empire, the Greeks are still there. And Diodorus isn't a traveller. He's a historian. He collects other people's sources and brings them together, just like a historian would do nowadays. And what he does is he collects the account of this author just here. This guy here is called Putheas or Massaliotes. That's Putheas or Pythias of Massalia. Massalia was the ancient Greek name for Marseille. Marseille is the modern name applied to an ancient Greek colony. I think that's really, really cool. And this guy over here, he's probably a student or a disciple of Aristotle. Aristotle was the most widely published author of ancient Greece, as far as I'm aware. He published more books than anyone else. Any person who's published more was Cicero and Marcus Aurelius, and they published in Latin. So Aristotle's a really important guy. And his disciple here, he's really interested in two things. Well, he's interested in a lot of things, but two principal things. Where are these ancient Greeks getting their tin from, and where's the amber coming from? And the question arises because they know that it's coming from somewhere far out west, but he wants to go and discover it. He wants to go be the person that actually goes and finds these things, and then do a load of other science whilst he's there. So he goes on this voyage. He starts off in Marseille, travels across the routes, and stands on the edge of the stair. He looks off into the unknown. No literate author knew what was beyond that water at that time period. He's the first man who does it. He gets on a boat and he travels across. And the world that he's inhabiting to archaeologists is the Latin time period. If you go through the British Museum, you actually walk through the Latin gallery, and you'll see these fantastic Triskeliae just here, and of course bronze copper bullion, and that piece of amber that he was looking for as well. Fantastic. This is his account, recorded to us by Diodorus about 250 years later. And when I saw this, my heart sank again, because it's all in Greek. I don't know what I was expecting. They have it nicely, neatly written in a nice language I could understand. But this sent me on my journey here of trying to understand this source material in its own right. And I actually think you know a little bit of ancient Greek already. Because if I said, what does this say? Can you see any words that you might be able to recognise there? So you can see just here, we've got Britannices. This is a book, Perites Britannices. This is the book on Britain written by Diodorus in his Bibliothecae Historicae. This is really interesting. So I went into more detail, and I found this little marginal note. This is really interesting. Look at this. Peri, that's a pi and an epsilon. Peri is on. So peri is next to or on the subject of. Next is, and this is really exciting, Kassiteron. Kassiteron. Well, that's the name of the talk. So we're getting close to what we're looking for here. And what I found was this whole text, there's a whole chapter that described the history of the British Isles and details that are relevant specifically to Cornwall and Devon. And I divided it up, and I found it just here. And of course, I'm not the first person to do this. It's all been published before. You can read it in nicely printed books, which even have a little bit of a translation as well next to it. But why would you want to do that? So we're going to look at it in detail ourselves, actually really get to the nuts and bolts of what's being said here. Because you can never trust a translation that's been done by a different person 100 years ago. It's always good to do it yourself. And also, it's a beautiful language. It's worth studying. So this is the section just here. This is the chapter that talks about Cornwall's earliest history. We're going to go into detail about it. When we look at this section just here, we can see there are a few things that stand out. There's a few dots just here. These are interpuncts. They are the equivalent of a semicolon. The Greeks, if you look really closely, there's actually no spaces between, there's no words in there as such. What Greek that was written down like this, you had to speak it out loud, and when you spoke it out loud, they start to make sense. Imagine if you wrote down on a text message or something, a load of words and no spaces. It would be difficult to read silently, but if you were to speak it out loud, the magic of the word would bring the meaning to life. This was the idea behind the process. But there's no spaces, so good job understanding it. But the section starts just here, and we can work our way through. It's quite interesting. Yes, so for example, do we have Greek speakers with us tonight? I thought so, don't worry. I can say anything and get away with it, fantastic. So Greek, so one thing that's really nice about learning a different language to your own, particularly one that is very distantly related or not related to your own language, is it teaches you a lot about your own language in English. It turns out that English is what, as a language, is what linguists call analytical. We tend to add words to go and change meanings. But also, the word order is really important. For example, if I said, the farmer ploughs the field, that's a very different meaning to the field ploughs the farmer. But in synthetic languages, such as Greek or Latin, or to some extent modern languages as well, like German, the word order is not as important, used in other ways. So, if we look at this section just here, the other thing as well we got to understand is that Greek is a declined language. It doesn't have many little words, what we call particles, like of, to, in, on, etc. In fact, the way that you create meaning in Greek without using these small particle words of, in, to, and so on and so forth, are with inflections. That's where you actually change the word that you're using. You add a suffix onto it, typically, or an infix in the middle. You add a suffix that tells you whether it's relational, whether it's derivative, and so on and so forth. For example, the definite article just here. In Cornish, the definite article is an. In Greek, it's dawn, and we find it just here. It actually declines with the rest of the text. We can see if we look down and we find a word like this, torn, we can find in this declension table that actually it could be the plural masculine, but it could also be the plural feminine or the plural neuter genitive. That's interesting. Genitive means of, and so it's an attributive relationship of things. By the way, no native Greek speaker needs to. This is something that's only necessary for native English speakers. We don't do this. Our brains work very differently. But this would be absolutely intuitive for the author of this text. So we look in a table like that to go and translate it. And then for nouns, we go and find the same thing. We see just there's actually an agreement between the definite article and a nomimon, which means normal or accustomed to. And we can find it just here in the plural neuter. So if you really, really want to go away and do some ancient Greek translation this evening, don't worry. This is how you do it. I've got you covered. But let's go and speed things up a little bit and go through. If I go and read through this, for example, I'm going to start a little bit through. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a little bit of this out. You're not going to understand it, but that's completely fine. What I'd like you to do is just sort of imagine in your head that this person who's writing this down, it may or may not be his exact words that he used, but he is the first literate person to lay eyes on Cornwall and describe the place that we now live in. And I want you to listen to the language and how alien it sounds, how bizarre it sounds, and think about how far we've come as a society ever since then. Greek as well, it's what's known as a tonal language. And so my voice is going to sound a little bit weird because I go up and down, and that is very weird in English, but don't forget it's how we form a question or not a question. And so tones are very, very important. And of course, in Greek, they are phonemic. You can change the meaning of a word depending on whether it's high or low. So have a listen and see what you think. Alla perimenton katauten nomimon, kaitor lon idiomaton the katameros, anangrapsomen, hutan epiten kaisaros, kenomenen streteienis, paretanian. I'm using a pronunciation which wouldn't even be that relevant to. I've occasionally a few modern Greek speakers have turned up to my talks, and they go, "That was really weird Greek you were speaking there, Ben," and that's because I'm using a pronunciation as well that's contemporary with this text. So that is as close as I can physically make it to my linguistic abilities to what this person actually would have said. But for example, if we go over this word again, Bretanian, what could that? You said it exactly. I told you could speak ancient Greek already. Fantastic work, everyone. Really, really good. Bretanian, paragen, nun de paritu katauten fuomenu kateteru diaxamen. Kateteru, kassiteros. That is our word. And look at this. This just here. This funny looking rock, this dark thing, what's it called? It's called Kassiterite, with a C in modern English with a modern ending. And we've just seen it written down in a source from the 4th century BC. Kassiteru diaxamen, that's a genitive ending for kassiteros. That's really cool. This is the text that's talking about this. The specific meaning of that is he's saying that it's in a literary style. He's flowing through the text as he's going. And he's talking, he's a historian, and so a bit like me, he rambles. All right, and he's moving along through subject matter. He's going from one subject to another, and he's saying, we're going to get to the rest of the British history in a minute. But for now, we're going to talk about the tin that Britain produces. Bretanian, paragomenen, and then Kassiteru, just there, the tin that Britain produces. There's only 2 places in the British Isles that produces tin, and we are in one of them. The other one is Devon. And that's amazing. So because this text anchors ourselves in Devon and Cornwall, this is the beginning of Cornish history. This is from nearly 2,400 years ago, and it's written down. The word is the closest you can ever get to another human mind without meeting them in person. And we're literally getting inside his mind by reading words. I think that's amazing. So, Kassiteros, we found that already. What else can we see? Britannian. Well, what I've done is I've taken that text, I've extracted all the ancient Greek names and plotted it on a map of the British Isles. Just here we have Britannian. By the way, the particular font that I'm using here, if you have ever seen modern Greek printed, it doesn't look like that. And this is because this is medieval Byzantine Greek, so there's a paleography dimension as well. And because I've been a bit obsessed with the subject matter, I've taught myself that as well. You don't have to do this to speak Greek. I mean, normal Greek people are very, very normal. This is quite weird. Britannices, just there, or Britannicae. That's the name of Britain. We've also got Gantion. Gantion. What could Gantion be? It's the modern day Kent. It's a word that we would recognise today, and here he is using it 2,400 years ago. I think that's amazing. We've got Irenen, Irmene, which is Ireland. Yeah, fantastic. This is the name of the chap, Bouthes Liotes. Orsican. Almost. What's the island? Exactly. Exactly. See, you're already halfway through speaking Greek. You can understand it already. But think about what you're doing by recognizing these words. You're listening to a man who wrote this down in a different language 24 centuries ago, and you can still understand what he meant about it all that time later. That is amazing. We should all be proud that he's done that. This is the start of British history. I know I keep on saying it, but it's amazing for me. It's amazing that this is still accessible to us. It hasn't been lost to the mists of time. Down here is really interesting because we can see there's a strange little word here. This here is Leon. We find it just here. Let's see if I can find it in the text. Desgard Britannices. Katato Acroterion. Acroterion is headland. Acroterion to Kalumanon called Belerion. Belerion. You won't know that name, it hasn't survived. But they're saying just here, the inhabitants of Britain who live on a promontory known as Belerion, promontory headland, hoi katakuntes, philoxenai to their BC, they produce with skillful techniques. Philoxenai, they are lover of strangers. Zenoi is strangers, and love is philos, so it's love of strangers. They're hospitable. De frontisi, gaidia, ten porn, xenon emporon, mixian exmermenoi, das agrogas. So they produce the tin, which I think is really, really cool. Epimixian exmermenoi, das agrogas, hutoi ton Kassiteron. They produce the tin. Kataskiwazusi philotechnos, with skillful techniques, love of technique. Ergazomenoi ten feruson autongen. So they're produced. So it's the inhabitants of this place called Belerion, this headland in Britain, that produce tin. What's that a description of? That's a description of us, which I think is really, really cool. Getting on to the next bit, this is where it gets really, really exciting. Auta de petroresusa diafuas, ekigeodis. Very, very cool. Geodis just here. So geodis, that's where we get the word geology from. Geodis means earthy, or to do with the earth. Geo is the great word for earth. The way I translate, this is actually an out-of-date translation, but basically what they're doing here, they're describing the place where they actually extract the tin, and they're saying, and what that means is that the earth is rocky, but the thing they're producing is something called a diafuas. Diafuas, D means two, and then fuas means type, I believe. And so he's describing basically a stratigraphic deposit, a bit like those tin streams that we saw earlier on in the presentation, where the tin ground had weathered and settled in the bottom of stream beds, a little bit like you find with gold. Quite exciting. So he's describing that. And this is what we find. It's very, very similar to the stream workings that we see. These are medieval examples. What he's describing is a technique. It's something that probably existed in ancient Greek times as well as in medieval times. And what's amazing is that we actually find places like Dartmoor and Bodmin Moor absolutely scattered with this stuff. You can't go anywhere in Dartmoor without finding evidence of these deep gouges that have been washed into the hillside. And this is an example of that tin streaming, which appears to be described by this ancient Greek author 2,400 years ago. I actually wrote a paper, the best part of 4 or 5 pages, on that one sentence and its translation difficulty alone. So it's not easy to translate these things. And what I mean by that is not that you can't understand the grammar. The grammar is very easy. But the individual words, they don't necessarily have obvious meanings in the corpus, and you've got to look at lots of different examples and see how you translate these things. Cool beans. So Dartmoor is full of these things. They're candidate sites for what this could describe. He goes on, and I'm going to use the English from here to speed things up. He says, but then they impress or cast the tin, once they've extracted it, into astragallos size or shaped pieces, carrying to an iron that lies before Britain. What on earth is an astragallos? How often do you go around and see an astragallos? Well, if you're a chiropractor, you might go and know what these things are. Is anyone a chiropractor? Don't worry. So one of the bones of the wrist is actually called an astragalus today. That's actually called an astragalus. And we find these in lots of mammalians as well, including sheep and goats. And back in the day, they're actually used as gaming tokens. So when I went to the Forum Romano in Italy, I found this wonderful display, and it talks about all these astragali. And next to it, it had this. Well, these are metal ingots that are almost exactly the same shape as astragali, just like what this author Pythias is saying about how they cast the tin. And what's really nice about these little ingots, they're not like these big bars that are really heavy. I don't know whether you ever held a metal ingot before, but they're really heavy. They're not the sort of thing you can easily put in a pocket. These things are really nice. You can put them in a pocket. The other benefit is that if you're using an open hearth fire, not like a blacksmith's forge, but an open hearth fire, you can melt these things. So there's a real advantage to having these small ingots that are the same size as these common gaming tokens. And if you go to Pompeii, you find wonderful paintings like this. These are some ancient Greek ladies playing a game of knucklebones with the astragali, which I think is really, really cool. That's from Pompeii. It's a copy of an earlier Greek painting. And the original painting has the names up here. The ladies are named, and I think this lady here is called Phoebe, and then this lady over here is called Neve, and they're actually starting to have a fight, so they obviously put some stakes on it. So very, very important things. And what Diodorus and Pythias is conjuring up in his mind is a very common image, a small piece of tin ingot. Quite interesting. So we understood that. What about this place over here, though? If I go back, this island that they carry it to called Ictine. Where could that be? Well, it's not an easy one to translate, so let's have a look. Can we find it in other sources of the time period? Well, if we fast forward a few centuries, we get to this gentleman over here. This guy over here, it's not an original painting, obviously, but this guy here is called Ptolemaeus, or Ptolemy, Claudius Ptolemy. He is a mathematician, and he's really interested in the stars. And what he's doing is he's trying to work out a mathematical way that he can project a map the stars onto a flat paper, so you can map out the stars. It's quite a useful thing to do, right? Nowadays it's very easy to do that, but he was the first person to do this. When he succeeds in doing that, he says, I've thought about mapping the inside of a sphere. Why don't I now map the outside? And then, of course, he turns himself into a geographer. And that's what he does. He collects together basically a database of all these different place names that he knows around the Roman Empire. Don't forget, he is based down here in Alexandria. So he is a Greek Egyptian. I think that's quite a cool combination to be. He's collecting together information from the Roman Empire. It's these sorts of layers that you've got to understand if you're studying classics. Never a simple story. The politics is every bit as complex as it is in the modern day. As far as the British Isles is concerned, he collected together an unfathomable amount of information. He records 130 different place names for the British Isles. If I challenged you to name 130 different places that are outside of Devon and Cornwall, would you be able to do it? I'd imagine some of you could. I think I could. And this ancient Greek Egyptian, he managed to do it 2,000 years ago. It's amazing. Let's look at what he says, and of course it's in the Vatican Library. So I found the original text. This is the original text for it. This one's quite late. It's about 800 years old, but it's still really interesting, and I've extracted the bits that relate to Cornwall by looking at here. Let's see if we can decipher any of these. So just here we've got Sabrinais Coussis. Sabrinais Coussis, what could that be? We've got Zelais Coussis, and then we've got Erechleos Akron. We've got Antiwesteon Akron Tokrai Bolerion. Bolerion. We've already had that word. That's Bolerion. We found another reference to Cornwall here. Because don't forget, Bolerion was a promontory of the British Isles that produced tin. That's a description of us. That's the earliest name for Cornwall, before Cornwall was known as Cornwall. The name seems to refer to probably something like Belar, the god, or it could refer to Bel, which is the Indo-European or Indo-Celtic word for warfare. So it's not very nice, is it, really? But that's where you get bello or bellus or bellicos, which is the Spanish word for war, for example. And the same thing in bello is war in Latin, for example. And so it may well be a kind of a violent, not particularly nice name in that respect. Or it could be a name of a god, very similarly. Also, you've got Damnonion Tokaya Krion Akron. This is really, really cool. Damnonion is named after the Damnoni people, the people who were called the Damnoni. These refer to the deep down people. This was the tribe that inhabited Belerion. This was the original name for the Cornish people, which I think is really, really cool. It seems to refer as deep down or southerly people. Very cool. So what could this be? Sabrinais is almost certainly the 7. And oh, look at this. He gave the coordinates as well, so you can map this out. And you actually produce a map of this, which is really, really cool. So we've got Sabrinais. Down here, this is probably, Zelais is probably the Barnstable River, which used to be known as the Allen. Now, Altiwesteon Toker Bolerion is the promontory of Bolerion, of Cornwall. That's Land's End. That's an ancient Greek-Egyptian description of Land's End. Absolutely amazing. Damnonion Toker Krion Akron, this is the really exciting one, because that is the Lizard Point. That's the other cardinal point. That is a description for us where we are right now in ancient Greek Egyptian, and there it is. Damnonion Tokai Okrion Akron. Okrion means high. Does anyone know what the etymology for the word lizard in Cornish is? Where that comes from? Lizard. It comes from high court, doesn't it? Isn't it interesting that the ancient Greek word, the ancient Greek name for the lizard for the lizard point was high headland? I think that's interesting, isn't it? Not necessarily implying continuity, but they've observed the same thing in the landscape. So what about the outline of the south coast? Well, we have a description of rivers, which is really, really interesting. So over here we have Genionos, Potamu Ekbolai, and then you have Temaru Potamu Ekbolai. Potamu Ekbolai means river mouth. So Potamu is where we get the word hippopotamus from. Hippos is horse, and then Potamu is river. So hippopotamus is river horse. So you know this already, actually. But so much of our language is descended from Greek or Latin, and so it's really nice to actually see the etymology as well. And ekbolai is mouth, so this is river mouth. What could maru, what could that refer to? You knew it already. Isn't that amazing? Again, you're reading something, and it's like time doesn't matter. It's like the last 1,800 years doesn't matter. You can still read it, you can still understand it. Isgar Belai is the River Exe, goes through Exeter. Alano is probably one of the other rivers that goes through Devon. And what's really interesting just here is this Genionos. It seems to refer to the River Kenwyn. We don't have a better etymology for the word Kenwyn. It was associated with a saint in the 14th century, but in the 12th, that saint didn't exist, so it had been made up. So for all we know, this Genionos might actually be an ancient Greek place name, which is really exciting, or at least a Cornish place name that's rendered in ancient Greek. We then have the Tamaru, which is River Tamar. We understand that. Then have the towns. We have Woliba, Orkazela, Demare, Iska, so on and so forth. Now, we know where Iska and Tamare are. Iska is, of course, Exeter, and of course this Roman fort here is a good candidate for it. That's now underneath the main roundabout in Exeter, which I think is quite cool. It's still there, but it's been filled back over. And Tamari is probably a fort that's been found in Calstock. The other two we don't know. One of them could be Luxillian, because Luxillian doesn't have a good etymology, for example. Could that be the same as Ukazala, Luxillian? Who knows? When you plot this out, this is one of the original codices here that was produced in Byzantium, in Constantinople. And when we look in detail, we can see loads of these names that we can recognise, certainly if you know Greek. This is an interesting one down here. There's the Kenionos, for example. What's this? Well, this just here says it's got a ligature which unites omicron, which is the Greek O, and then upsilon, which is the Greek U. So it's wektis nessus. Well, that's quite similar. What's that, sorry?
I was rather joking, it was Mullion Island.
Mullion Island, exactly. Mullion Island? No. Would it be fantastic to spoof some of these documents? One of my sort of like darker thoughts is I also study hieroglyphs. I'm not very good at it, and cuneiform, the Mesopotamian writing system. And I always thought it'd be quite nice to go and make one of these clay tablets that says Ben was here, but translated into sort of like, you know, 2nd millennium BC Akkadian, and sort of hide it somewhere, maybe on St. Michael's Mount. Don't tell anyone, but let someone discover it in a few hundred years' time, see what they think. Anyway, so yeah, we got Wektis Nessus. Nessus is island. Wektis is very similar to Ictin that we were looking for earlier. And we see just here, we got Megalimena, which is the Great Harbour. So below the Great Harbour, so below the Great Harbour is this island, Wektis Nessus. Wektis. Absolutely right. Absolutely right. I don't have any stars to hand out, folks. I wouldn't have enough anyway. You're all fantastic. This is actually, so this is a later copy of earlier manuscripts. Remember how I said that the original authors wrote on papyrus and then copy it over and over again? There's no printing press, so you have to get your slaves to go and copy out onto parchment, so on and so forth. Well, we have one fragment of this text that survived, this tiny little fragment just here. That's all we have. And the best part about it is that it survived enough detail that you can read it and you can see the coordinates. And if only this little part had survived, it would have talked about Cornwall. And literally, because I transcribed the whole thing, I corresponded it with the more modern text, the medieval text. And literally the part here, well, it's not quite there, but literally the part that would be there, that is the part that talked about Cornwall. It would have been an original 2nd century papyrus. It just wasn't to be. That is one of the few sort of really gutting things that history was so close to it, but it just didn't happen. When you look at the other medieval manuscripts of a sister work to this, you find this. It's actually spelt quite differently. This is the name for the Isle of Wight, whether it's Wektis. You can see this here. It's Wektis, and then you can Wektis, Wikten, just there. They're actually spelling it with an iota rather than epsilon, which is interesting. But in this one was the smoking gun. When I found this manuscript, I saw this. Wiktis Neson. Iktis. This is the island that we were talking about earlier. In Ictin, which is the genitive form, Iktis is the nominative form. And we're seeing it just here in the nominative, Iktis Nessus. Remember, Greek synthetic language, it has to change the ending depending on who you're talking about and what you're talking about. In this case here, they're talking directly about the subject, Wiktis. Wiktis was a name for this island just here. But this is a little bit weird, all right? This is a little bit weird. When we understand it all, when we put it all together, this is here the Ictin, Ictis, from this book just here, this is where we all bring it together. It is the Isle of Wight. And it's really interesting because that name as a word, remember we were talking about the etymology of things like Belerion, Orcan, so on and so forth. Well, we actually find a fragment of that name, that Ictis, Wiktis name, just here. We find it in Ordovikes. Ordo means upright, and then that's ortho. Ordo is hammer, and then vikes. It's interesting. I was looking at different etymologies for this. There's various etymologies for it. One of them is like a rodent. There's a like a Wiktis rodent, but that didn't seem to make sense really. Instead, what it seems to come from is the Proto-Celtic word for violence, wikt or wekt. Why would you name yourself or your island after violence? This is the name of the tribe, Ordovikes, the violent hammer people. Well, it seems to be an example of culture that you would find, it's actually quite universal in terms of studies of anthropology, where you name yourself really violent tribal names. It's like the war tribe or whatever. For example, one of the tribes across in France were the Belowaki. They were literally the war people. Another example of this is what do pirates call themselves? Blackbeard, so on and so. They don't call themselves Fred the Cuddly, do they? You know, you call yourself something really violent. Stay away from me. Don't go and fight with me. Similarly, also with Vikings, Ivar the Boneless, you know, so on and so forth. These are names to try and keep people away. Don't touch me, I'm violent. And you see this, of course, in modern tribal societies as well. This Ordowices and this Wictis as well. It seems to be an example of a tribal name that denotes violence, which was very common at the time period. We see it in other manuscripts as well. In, for example, Latin manuscripts. This is the Antonina Timeri. It's essentially a Roman road map in written form, and it lists all the place names. One of them here is Ecta, which is white. Over here in the Ravenna cosmography, another list of place names from the Roman world, the late Roman world, the late antique world. We find just here Wectis, again just there, from Bede's Ecclesiastical History. Bede was the first British author to write the history of the British Isles, named Gildas. You can see just here, Wictuari. This is the name of the people from Wictis, which I think is quite cool. And then what's even cooler, if you go into the Celtic side of things, you can go to Ireland and look at medieval Irish manuscripts and find this as well. So this is a glossary. It's basically a folk etymology of various words in Irish. And one of the words that we find just here is he's actually talking about mohaim, which is an Irish word for dog. And he's constructing a story around it. And basically, part of this story, it actually involves travelling from Ireland over to France. And on the way, he crosses this thing called Mara Nicht. Mara Nicht. Nicht. This is literally the Sea of Wight, the Sea of the Isle of Wight, the Sea of Ictis, which I think is really, really cool. And when we go to the Welsh sources, we find it as Gwyth, which is the standard Welsh consonantal mutation of that w sound. In linguistics, we call that the bilabial voiced approximate w. It's a fancy name for a very simple thing, but that sound change is very common that you see. For example, you see it in Gwyth and Gwyl. We have that in Cornish as well. Gwyl means works in Cornish. Originally, it would have been wheel in Proto-Celtic. And even if you go into Anglo-Saxon, this is the coolest thing. So how many languages have we done now? Like 4 or 5? If we go into Anglo-Saxon, we can see witwara. I know they look like P's, but they're actually wins. And it's the Anglo-Saxon letter win, which is a w. So it's witwara, which is the name for the island. By the time you get to the Doomsday Book, you find it as wit, or wheat. Fantastic. So the way that you transcribe these phonetics, throughout this presentation, I'm speaking in strange ways, and the way that you transcribe all of that is quite, you use something called the International Phonetic Alphabet, and that's these funny-looking symbols just here. Most of the symbols look fairly recognizable, but like, what's that funny-looking thing, for example, and so on and so forth. What's that? And what's that? English, when you write down letters in English, the letters actually don't stand for sound. I know that sounds bizarre, but for example, the letter E can either stand for an E or an E, can't it? Depending on the word. And it makes it really difficult to go and, for example, know what the pronunciation of something is like in confidence without speaking to other people in person, doesn't it? Everyone's had an experience where you know, Worcestershire, so on and so forth. How do you pronounce these things? Well, in the International Phonetic Alphabet, each letter has an individual sound that corresponds with it. There's no what's known as allophonic variation between the sounds. And so I transcribed all these things here, and I found that they're functionally identical, which is really interesting. So the name evolution, starting from Iktin in the ancient Greek, ended up as wit in the Isle of Wight, we recognise today. It appears in other sources as well. For example, just here, we find insulam mictim in Pliny. And what he says, Timaios historicus a Britannientrosus sextiare navigatone, abestit insula mictim, in qua candidum plumbum proveat, ariam Britannos vitilibus navicis curiosorcum sutis navigare. So he says, he's quoting someone else, he says Timaeus, who was the predecessor to Diodorus. He also lived in Sicily. interestingly, he also used Pythias as a source. And he says that there's an island called Mictim, which is probably a misspelling of Wictim, is 6 days' sail from the area of production in Trosum, which is what that means. So 6 days' sail from where it was produced in Britannia, in which the white lead is found. White lead is the Greek word for tin. In fact, we also find it in Akkadian and ancient Greek as well, and ancient hieroglyphs as well, which is very interesting, ancient Egyptian. And the Britons sail over to it in these things called corrio. And the actual translation for that is boats that are sewn with leather, which I think is quite nice. Boats sewn with leather. What does that mean? Well, from the area of production, whether we take it as Devon or Cornwall, it's about 170 miles. Could you do that in 6 days? I think you could do that in 6 days. About 30 miles a day. I think you could probably sail 30 miles a day. These are the boats they would have been using. This is a hide boat or a leather boat. What you've got to think about, it's willow. It's like a big willow basket that you just make waterproof by putting tannalized hides around the outside. And you can see some of these here. The Irish tradition for this were amazing. Remember some of the sources that we were talking about were in Irish? The original Celtic culture of the British Isles, that in many respects was lost in Cornwall because its proximity to Latinite Rome, was preserved in Ireland. If you want to know what Cornwall was really like at this time period, the best thing you can study is medieval Ireland or early medieval Ireland. Early medieval Ireland and Cornwall were part of a shared culture back at that time period. And these are the boats preserved in the Irish record that the Cornish would have been using to transport that tin. Things like this, archaeological record, the Broiter boat made out of gold, that was found as well. Caesar weighs in as well. What Caesar says? He says, Nascito rebi plumbum album in mediterranis regionibus, in maritimis ferrum, serios exiqua est copia, aere tuntor importato, aere tuntor importato. Copper is imported. Why is copper imported to the British Isles? How bizarre. And of course, they produce tin in the Midlands region, or terra mediterranis, or regionis regionibus, mediterranis regionibus. Why would you produce tin inland in the Midland regions? Well, if I transported you to the middle of Dartmoor and I said, are you inland or are you close to the coast? You'd probably say you're inland, aren't you? So it's probably quite a good description for tin working on Dartmoor. Maybe not so much in Cornwall, though. And again, we go back to those streamworks that we saw. Now, there is a problem. There is a problem with our identification, our translation, because the very next sentence that is contained in this source by Pythias, he says, at low tide, the area between this island, between Ictin, or Ictis, becomes dry, and they can carry the tin over to it in wagons. That's not the case for the Isle of Wight. The Isle of Wight is an island, and it's been an island for thousands and thousands of years. But there is a factor that we need to consider, and that's called glacio-isostatic adjustment. It's not a very easy talk, is it, folks, to keep up with? You're doing very, very well. Very, very well. Glacio-isostatic adjustment. If you want to win Scrabble, I'm giving you the trump card here. So think about it that way. So glacio-isostatic adjustment is very, very interesting. Of course, we had an ice age up until quite recently. And what I mean by that is that about 20,000 years ago, we had the last glacial maximum. What happens in an ice age? You have a lot of glaciers form, don't they? Glaciers are pretty heavy, and because the Earth's crust is somewhat malleable, and because the Earth's mantle is liquid, the heavy weight of the glaciers will actually push down the surface of the land somewhat. It happens very slowly and very subtly, but it does occur. What happens when the glaciers melt? Well, there's no longer that weight there, and you get rebound. The Earth's crust actually rises upwards, and so relative to other places on the Earth's surface, to the epsiloid as we call it, you can actually see relative changes downwards and upwards in the Earth landmass. Think about this. If you have land that's sinking, what's it going to look like? Because we don't know we're sinking. We just go and live our lives, live our 80 or 90 years, hopefully, and then we pop off to the next person. But over generations, differences can be occurred. What's it going to look like over time if the Earth's surface is sinking slowly in respect to sea level? It's going to look like the sea level's rising, isn't it? And of course, if it's rebounding, what's it going to look like? It's going to look like the Earth, the level of the sea is slowing down. When we map these things out, we find that there's an isobar, which means a change between uplift and inversion, that means sink and rise, that goes through about Plymouth. And so we find that whilst the rest of the British Isles is rising, recovering from this glacial rebound where it is lower and now it's rising back upwards, the southwest is actually sinking relative to the sea level. And so from our perspective, it looks like sea level rise. Does that make sense? It's a bit tricky to get your head around. So when we go to the Isles of Scilly on our nice holidays, if we look on the salt flats, like off Tresco just here, there actually remains of field systems. You might have noticed these before if you have a really good archaeological eye. There's no good building a field system there. It's full of the sea. And that's because it turns out that the Isles of Scilly were all one island, literally during the Roman time period. It's really recent that they've actually become inundated. We know this because we can date the field systems. What we do is we put augers down, we drill up the peat, and you can actually date the peat because of course it's made of carbon, can't you? And so you can date it at the last time that was exposed to sunlight or at least fresh water, and not the salt water that we see here. And you find that actually much of these flats were only inundated in post-Roman times. So there's been a lot of sea level change since that 2,400 year text has occurred. We can see it plotted just here. What I did is I studied it using this data set of the Cornish coastline known as the digital elevation model. And I looked at Mounts Bay. Another contender for this site of Ichthys is, of course, St Michael's Mount. And I wanted to see whether or not this was possible, whether it was feasible. Was St Michael's Mount actually an island or a tidal island at this time period? And so what I did is I programmed in data for that sea level rise, and I got this. And it shows, with the green line here, that at the time period, the 2,400 BC, 2,400 years ago, about 300 BC, St Michael's Mount actually wasn't an island, it was just a headland. What's the original name for St Michael's Mount in Cornish? Caraclus in Lus. It's the grey rock in the wood. It's an island. It would have been called the Ennis or the Ennis if that were the case. St Michael's Mount has only been an island in recent history and not in the Iron Age. But the Isle of Wight is still not a tidal island. This is still a really bad identification for that. But look a bit north. Look inland. Look at the hinterland. Look at these. This is really interesting. If we look a bit closer on this map, can you see there's not just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these tidal islands. You've got Portsea, you've got Hayling, you've got Thanet, you've got Selsey. There's tons of tidal islands. And these are all home to modern day sailing clubs. And don't forget, there's been negligible sea level change because we saw it from that glacial isostatic model on the previous slide. He talks about what's really interesting is he talks about, first of all, that this island is intertidal, that it's connected by a tombolo, just like you get on St Michael's Mount. But then he says something interesting. He says the peculiar thing happens in the case of the neighbouring islands as well, because he says that flood tides, the passages run dry, they're intertidal. He says that the neighbouring islands are also intertidal islands. Even if St Michael's Mount was an island in the Iron Age, which it wasn't, it wouldn't be neighbouring other intertidal islands. This, however, is different. It's right next to the Isle of Wight, and which is that Wigton that we're talking about, and they're all intertidal. How absolutely fascinating. If we look at these maps just here and go a little bit more detail, we can see, this is the best part about it, this is the modern day Langstone over here, and then this is the Hayling Island Yacht Club. This is the modern day road bridge here, but look at this snaky looking thing. That is the original Wade Way. That is how people up until the 1820s got to Hayling Island. They'd walk across this raised way. We know that it's at least Roman, and it might be much, much earlier than that. Certainly there's lots of Iron Age maritime history that you find in the archaeological record on Hayling Island, which I think is really, really interesting. And it all makes sense. It makes sense of the amazing archaeological record that we find. Hengistbury Head was the most important Greek trading settlement in the whole of the British Isles, and that's literally right next to this site just here, right next to the hinterland. We find that, look at this, all these Roman roads point down towards London, but they also point down towards the Isle of Wight because don't forget, when you go to the medieval time period, what's the most important tin trading port in medieval times? It's Southampton. What's one of the most important ports today? It's Southampton. For the same reasons that it is a trading hub now, it was back then. And we can see from, for example, articles like this, Maritime Rollers Vectis in the British Iron Age, it makes sense of that. Of course, the largest Roman palace outside of Rome itself at Fishbourne was built right next to it as well, the Brading Roman Villa. And when we look at numismatic data, we can see there's a real concentration around this area. Absolutely fascinating. Of course, there's other real concentrations east. Fantastic. We can also see this trend in inscribed Roman ingots. It's not just a phenomenon that exists for tin, it seems to be the case for other metals as well. We see all of these lead ingots from Yorkshire, from Derbyshire, but also from the Mendips. And of course, they're mining this lead to extract the silver through cupellation to pay their military, aren't they? The military used to get those little silver ingots. That's how they'd be paid. And what's really interesting is that these authors theorise that lead trade actually went through, again, Southampton and the Isle of Wight and its trading channels there. And then this author, which is really interesting, he's actually looking at the trading patterns of Bronze Age copper, and he's hypothesised that, again, it goes through the same mechanism. And so what we're looking at here is that really the Isle of Wight had become the London Metal Exchange of the Iron Age. If you wanted to go to the Isle of Wight, yes, it was a long journey. Wouldn't it be easy to go from Cornwall? But if I plonked you in one of those little, basically a big basket covered with hide, one of those hide boats, and I said, off you go to France, who would do it? That's what I thought, because I wouldn't do it either. That is a terrifying prospect. And if you go to the Isle of Wight, it's a day's sail. It's a long day's sail, but it's a day's sail. If you do it from Cornwall, it's 2 days sailing. I would not want to be out on sea with no maritime network, no Channel 16, no Coast Guard, no telephone, no modern equipment, no charts, no navionics. I would not want to do, no weather forecasts, no battery-operated torches. I would not want to do that myself, and I highly imagine that the people who were trading tin with Cornwall at this time period felt exactly the same. And also, if you're going to the Isle of Wight, which is the same place that you buy slaves and you buy dogs and pottery and all sorts of other things, when you go down to the shops to pick up some milk, why don't you also pick up some bread? You know, so it's quite a useful trading post. That's the reason that markets exist, to unite buyers with sellers. And that's what the Isle of Wight was. And that's what's being recorded in this ancient text. Cornwall had a link with the ancient Greek world through its place. Once it arrived there and then it headed off to the continent, what happened afterwards? Well, it arrived on these rivers and then went downwards. And we have accounts of this from this author Strabo here. So if you have corrective eyesight or corrective glasses, you might have been diagnosed with strabismus or strabismus. And he's actually named after that. So he's actually basically called, for want of a better word, it's a cognomen. He's basically called Squinty. We don't know what his real name is. We have no idea what his name is. It hasn't survived. But he has some amazing quotes, and he talks about the rivers that are used. He talks about the use of the Seine, just here the Sacana, the Liger, the Loire, and then the Garonne, and of course the Rhine. And that takes you from the British Isles across from Wight down to Massilia, which is where the tin is heading for. And what's wonderful is that this author has the earliest example in Strabo, in the 1st century AD, of a foreigner complaining about the English weather. Their weather is more rainy than snowy. On the days of clear sky, fog prevails so long that throughout the whole day the sun is only to be seen for 3 or 4 hours around about midday. That could have been the weather forecast for today, folks. It's 2,000 years ago. So another beautiful maps like this. It's a fairly long distance. In the text, it talks about 30 days, completely manageable. And what's really nice is we actually see with the Mediterranean authors, if you're good with languages, you can do searches in different languages. For example, Italian and French, and you find a completely different corpus of archaeology. I found this paper talking about tin shipwrecks that were found in the Mediterranean, and some of them seem to have come from Cornwall. One of them is found in Roscoff as well, which is nice, and they found these ingots just here that may well have come from Devon or Cornwall. So, we understand this text, because if you recognise it, that text is what we saw at the beginning of the talk. It hides away over there. But folks, I've been speaking to you for 5 minutes longer than I should be. I'm going to end the talk there on a cliffhanger. And if you want me back to finish the story, because we've still got more to talk about, because we need to talk about who this person was and what this funny name is, you're just going to have me again sometime. I'm going to end it there, folks. I'm going to end it there.